Sarah Voss had not slept a full night in 2 years. She told herself it did not matter. A queen did not need rest the way ordinary people did. She needed strength, and she had learned to build strength out of exhaustion, the way other people built houses out of stone. The silver pine territory stretched for miles beyond her window, dark pine forests rolling into misty hills, and somewhere out there her people were watching her, waiting to see if she would fall. 2 years ago, her mate, King Alaric, had died. The official story was an accident during a border patrol. Nobody quite believed it, but nobody could prove otherwise either, so the whispers stayed whispers, and Sarah had learned to walk past them with her chin high and her hands steady. She had 2 reasons to keep walking: Wren and Wolf, twins, born only weeks before their father died, too young to remember him, too young to understand why their mother sometimes stared out the window for a long time without saying anything. They were 4 years old now, full of noise and mischief, and they were the only thing that made the empty side of her bed feel less like a wound and more like a fact she had simply learned to live with. The council did not make things easy. Every week there was a new complaint. Aluna cannot hold a throne alone, they said, not to her face, but loud enough that the words always found their way back to her. A pack needs an alpha king standing beside its queen, not just a queen standing alone. Sarah had heard this argument in a dozen different shapes for 2 years, and every time she answered it the same way. She said Silver Pine did not belong to whoever stood beside the throne. It belonged to whoever was willing to bleed for it, and she had bled for it more than anyone. Still, on the morning everything changed, even she could not have guessed how much her careful, guarded world was about to be shaken. Most mornings started the same way. She woke before the sun, checked on the twins while they still slept, and then spent an hour reviewing reports from every corner of Silverpine before the council even gathered. It was not glamorous work. It was grain counts and patrol schedules and disputes between neighboring farms over fence lines. The kind of work no one wrote songs about, but the kind of work that kept a territory standing all the same. The council meetings themselves were the hardest part of her days. She would sit at the head of the long table, and no matter how well she had prepared, no matter how sound her decisions were, there would always be at least one voice suggesting, in careful, respectful language, that perhaps things would run more smoothly with an alpha king at her side. She had grown skilled at deflecting these comments without losing her temper, though it cost her something every single time, a small piece of patience she could never quite get back by the end of the day. It began with horns, not the soft horns used to call the pack home from patrol, but the long, deep horns that meant a stranger of high rank was approaching the gates. Sarah was in the middle of braiding Wren's hair when she heard them, and her hands went still for a moment before she set the ribbon down and reached for her formal coat. "Where are you going?" Wren asked, her small face already curious. "Someone important is here," Sarah said. "Stay with old Mira. I will come back for you soon." She did not know yet how wrong that promise would turn out to be, not because she would break it, but because soon was about to mean something very different once Wren and Wolf met the man standing at her gates. By the time Sarah reached the courtyard, half her council was already there, along with dozens of pack members drawn by the horns. And in the middle of it all stood a man she had never seen in person, though she had heard his name whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect for most of her life. Damien Ashgrove, Alpha King of the Ashgrove Empire, the largest and strongest wolf territory east of the mountains. He was tall, in the way that made people instinctively step back, with dark hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of stillness that came from a man who had learned long ago that showing emotion was the same as showing weakness. He wore no crown, no obvious symbol of his rank, because he did not need one. Everyone in that courtyard already knew exactly who he was. Behind him stood a line of soldiers, disciplined and silent, and beside him an older man in gray robes held a long scroll sealed with red wax. "Queen Voss," Damien said, his voice calm, almost bored, as if this visit meant nothing more to him than checking a box on a very long list. "I did not come to fight you. I came to inform you of something that concerns your throne." Sarah kept her spine straight. "You are welcome to speak, King Ashgrove. You are not welcome to threaten." A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "Then let us hope this does not sound like a threat, though I understand it might." He nodded to the man beside him, who unrolled the scroll and began reading. It was an old treaty, centuries old, signed long before either of their bloodlines had been born, back when Silverpine and Ashgrove had once been a single territory before splitting through war. Buried in the old language was a single clause that made Sarah's stomach turn cold. If the ruling bloodline of Silverpine was ever left without a living Alpha King, the throne could be reclaimed by the Ashgrove line, as the original founding family. "This is absurd," Sarah said, the moment the reading finished. "That treaty is centuries old. It has never once been enforced." "It has never needed to be enforced," Damien said. "Until now. Your king is dead, Queen Voss. You have led this territory alone for 2 years. By the old law, that qualifies." Whispers spread through the courtyard like fire through dry grass. Sarah felt every eye on her, felt the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides, felt her own pack members exchanging glances that asked, silently, "Is this really happening?" She wanted to scream that it was not fair, that she had given everything to this territory, that grief did not make her weak, but she knew screaming would only prove the very point her enemies had been making for 2 years. So instead, she straightened her shoulders and looked directly into Damien Ashgrove's eyes. "You may have an old scroll," she said, "but I have a living pack that will fight before they let you take 1 inch of this land. If you want Silverpine, King Ashgrove, you will have to earn it, not read it off a piece of paper." For just a second, something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like respect, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I expected nothing less," he said, "which is exactly why I intend to stay until this matter is settled properly. I will not force a war neither of us wants. But I will not walk away from a rightful claim either." And that was how it began, not with battle, but with an uneasy agreement that Damien Ashgrove would remain within Silverpine's walls while the council debated the old law, while messengers were sent to verify the treaty's authenticity, while everyone waited to see who would break first. That first night, Sarah barely slept, though this was nothing new for her. She sat by the window of her chambers, long after the castle had gone quiet, watching the guest wing across the courtyard, where a single lamp still burned behind Damien's window. She wondered what kind of man crossed half a continent over an old piece of paper. She wondered if he even believed in the treaty himself, or if it was simply a convenient excuse dressed up as duty. Kings did that sometimes, she knew. They wrapped their wants in the language of law so that no one, not even themselves, had to call it by its real name. She thought of Alaric, the way he used to sit beside her at this very window on nights when sleep would not come, telling her stories about his own father until her mind finally settled enough to rest. She missed that steadiness more than she let herself admit, even to herself, and for one brief, guilty moment, she wondered what it would feel like to have someone sit beside her at this window again. She pushed the thought away quickly, telling herself it was only exhaustion talking, only 2 years of carrying everything alone, finally catching up to her in the middle of the night. Across the courtyard, Damien was awake for very different reasons. He had traveled to dozens of territories in his life, negotiated with proud kings and desperate chieftains, stood his ground in rooms filled with people who wanted him gone. None of it had unsettled him the way the look on Sarah Voss's face had unsettled him that afternoon, the fierce, unshaken defiance in her eyes as she told him he would have to earn Silverpine rather than simply take it. He had expected fear. He had expected pleading, or anger, or the kind of desperate bargaining he usually got from rulers facing an old claim like his. He had not expected to be looked at like an equal, and he certainly had not expected to respect her for it before the conversation had even finished. He told himself this was simply strategy, that understanding an opponent was the first step to winning against them. But even as he thought it, some quieter part of him understood that whatever waited for him inside Silverpine's walls was not going to be a simple negotiation, and some quieter part of him, buried under years of careful control, was almost curious to find out what it would be instead. Sarah gave him a guest wing far from her own chambers, and made it very clear, through every polite but cold word she spoke to him over the following days, that he was a guest and nothing more. She did not trust him. She refused to be charmed by his calm voice or his sharp, watching eyes. She had buried a husband and built a kingdom out of grief, and she was not about to let a stranger with an old scroll undo any of it. What she had not planned for, what no one could have planned for, was her own children. It happened on the third evening of his stay. Sarah was in a council meeting that had already stretched 2 hours too long, arguing with an advisor named Colt Rayner about border patrols, when the twins slipped away from old Mira during a moment of distraction. They were small and quick and endlessly curious, and they had heard the servants whispering about the tall stranger from the east with the quiet voice, and 4-year-olds cannot resist a mystery for very long. They found him in the west study, standing alone by the window, looking out over the pine forest with an expression far more tired than the one he wore in public. He did not hear the door creak open. He did not notice 2 small figures creeping across the floor until Wolf, the bolder of the twins, tugged at the edge of his coat. Damien turned, startled in a way that surprised even himself. He was not a man who startled easily. "You're the wolf man everyone is scared of," Wolf said matter-of-factly, staring up at him without the slightest hesitation. Damien crouched down slowly, the way one might approach a nervous animal, though it was clear the child in front of him was not nervous at all. "Some people are scared of me, yes." "Are you going to hurt our mama?" Wren asked, standing slightly behind her brother, though her eyes were just as sharp. "No," Damien said, and something in his voice made the answer sound truer than anything he had said since arriving. "I am not here to hurt anyone." Wolf studied him for a long moment, the kind of serious, searching look that only children and very old wolves seem capable of giving. Then, without warning, he climbed straight into Damien's lap, curling against his chest, the way pups do when they recognize something familiar in another wolf's scent, something that speaks louder than words ever could. Wren followed a second later, pressing close to his other side. "Papa," Wolf said simply, resting his head against him. Damien went completely still. He was a man who had commanded armies, who had negotiated with kings twice his age, who had never once in his adult life been at a loss for what to do. And yet, in that moment, holding 2 small children who had chosen him with such simple, unshakable certainty, he had absolutely no idea what to say. It was in that position that Sarah found them minutes later, having finally escaped her meeting and gone looking for her missing children with rising panic. She stopped in the doorway, her heart lurching painfully at the sight in front of her. "Wren, Wolf, come here right now," she said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. The twins looked up, confused by her tone, but they obeyed, sliding down from Damien's lap and hurrying to their mother's side. Sarah knelt and checked them over quickly, as though expecting to find some kind of harm, though of course there was none. "They are unharmed," Damien said quietly, rising to his feet. "They simply wandered in. I did not call them here." "They called you something," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Do not let it happen again." "I did not ask them to say it," Damien replied, and for the first time since his arrival, his careful, composed mask slipped just slightly, revealing something almost like confusion beneath it. "Children do not lie about what they feel, Queen Voss. Perhaps you already know that better than I do." Sarah did not answer. She simply gathered her children and left, her mind spinning with something she refused to name. Old Mira found her pacing the nursery hallway an hour later, still fully dressed in her council clothes, her jaw tight with something that looked less like anger and more like fear. Mira had raised Sarah's own mother once, long before Sarah was born, and she had a way of seeing straight through a person that made lying to her useless. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mira said gently, setting down the basket of linens she had been carrying. "They called him Papa," Sarah said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "A stranger, A man who arrived here 3 days ago, holding a scroll that says he can take everything I have built." Mira was quiet for a long moment, folding one of the small blankets with slow, careful hands. "Pups don't lie about scent, my queen. Not at that age. They don't yet know how to want the wrong thing on purpose, the way grown wolves do." "That doesn't mean anything," Sarah said, though her voice wavered slightly on the words. "Maybe not," Mira agreed. "Or maybe it means more than either of you is ready to hear tonight. Either way, shouting at children for feeling something honest has never once fixed anything, in my experience." Sarah did not have an answer for that, so she said nothing at all, only sat down on the small bench outside the twins' room and stayed there long after Mira had gone, listening to the soft, even sound of her children's breathing through the door. That night, after the twins were finally asleep, Sarah sat alone in her chambers, turning the moment over and over in her mind. She told herself it meant nothing. Children were drawn to new faces, to novelty, to strangers who might play a game or tell a story they hadn't heard before. It did not mean anything. It could not mean anything. But wolf instincts ran deeper than ordinary human ones, and somewhere underneath her careful denials, Sarah knew that pups did not call just anyone Papa. They called the one whose presence felt, on some level too old for words, like home. Over the following days, Sarah tried to keep Damien and her children apart, but Silverpine Castle was large, and children were small and clever, and it was nearly impossible to keep two determined 4-year-olds from finding their way to whoever interested them most. They found him in the gardens, where he was inspecting the old stone wall along the eastern edge, and within minutes, Wren had talked him into helping her build a small fort out of loose bricks, giving orders in the serious, bossy tone only a 4-year-old in charge of construction can manage. They found him in the library, where Wolf insisted on showing him every single picture book on the lowest shelf, one at a time, refusing to let him leave until each one had been properly admired. And they found him, on one memorable afternoon, hiding under the dining table with him during a rainstorm because Wolf was convinced thunder was a giant wolf growling somewhere above the clouds. "He's angry," Wolf whispered, pressed close against Damien's side as another crash of thunder rolled overhead. "Why is he angry?" Damien, without missing a beat, settled the boy more comfortably against him and began a long, careful story about the great sky wolves who lived above the clouds, ancient and enormous, who did not growl out of anger at all, but simply because their voices were too big for anything but thunder to carry them. He told them the sky wolves loved storms the way ordinary wolves loved running through the forest, and that the rain was only their way of saying hello to every small creature listening below. "Is that true?" Wren asked, peeking out from her own spot under the table, clearly torn between believing him completely and suspecting he might be making it up as he went. "Every good story is true in the way that matters," Damien said, which was not really an answer at all, but seemed to satisfy both children completely. Sarah watched from the doorway that day, arms crossed, telling herself she was only there to make sure her children were safe. She stayed far longer than safety required, listening to a man who commanded armies invent stories about sky wolves for two children who had lost their father before they were old enough to remember his voice. Something in her chest ached at the sight, an old familiar ache she had gotten very good at ignoring, though it was harder to ignore that particular afternoon than it had been in a long time. Slowly, without either of them quite agreeing to it, the cold distance between Sarah and Damien began to soften into something else. It was not trust, not yet, but it was no longer pure suspicion either. They began sharing meals, at first only because the twins insisted on it, and then, gradually, because neither of them minded it as much as they once had. She learned things about him she had not expected. That he had lost his own parents young, in a conflict he rarely spoke of, and had been raised more by soldiers than by family. That he had built Ashgrove into the strongest territory in the region, not out of greed, but because he had grown up believing that strength was the only thing that kept people from being hurt the way he had been hurt. That underneath the cold, calculating king everyone whispered about, There was a man who had simply never been given a reason to be anything softer. He learned things about her too, that she had not always wanted to be queen, that she had once dreamed of a quieter life before duty and love had pulled her into the role she now carried so fiercely, that her strength was not born from ambition but from necessity, from watching a territory she loved nearly break apart and deciding, again and again, that she would not let it. "You could have left after Alaric died," Damien said one evening, as they sat by the fire while the twins played nearby with a set of carved wooden wolves. "Handed the throne to your council, started somewhere new." "I could have," Sarah agreed, "but this land is not just mine, it is theirs." She glanced toward her children. "I will not hand them a broken home simply because building it myself is hard." Damien was quiet for a long moment. "I understand that better than you might think." "What happened to your parents?" Sarah asked softly, surprising herself with the question. She had wanted to ask it for days but had not found the right moment until now, with the fire crackling low and the twins' laughter drifting from across the room. Damien was silent long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "A rival territory," he said finally. "I was younger than Ren and Wolf are now. I don't remember much of it, only pieces. My mother's voice, the sound of the gates giving way. I was raised after that by soldiers who taught me how to fight before anyone thought to teach me anything else." "That's not a childhood," Sarah said quietly. "That's a war you were handed too early." "It made me strong," Damien said, though there was less conviction in his voice than the words suggested. "It also made me forget what it looked like to sit by a fire like this without calculating who might be a threat in the room." Sarah glanced at him, and for the first time since his arrival, she saw not a rival king with an old claim, but simply a man who had spent his whole life building walls because no one had ever shown him he was allowed to put them down. "You could put the calculating away tonight," she offered. "Nobody in this room is a threat, unless you count Wolf's plans for that fort in the garden. He has informed me it will require at least 3 more bricks and possibly a moat." Damien laughed, a short, surprised sound, as though he had not expected himself capable of it. "A moat sounds like a significant escalation." "He gets that from his father," Sarah said, and then went quiet, surprised at how easily Alaric's memory had slipped into the conversation without the usual sharp pain following behind it. Damien did not fill the silence with anything clumsy. He simply let it sit there, comfortable and unhurried, the way only someone who understood grief without needing it explained to him could. Slowly, the twins' instinct that had seemed so strange on the first night began to feel less strange and more like something both adults were simply too afraid to admit out loud. But not everyone in Silverpine welcomed the changing atmosphere. Colt Rayner, the advisor who had clashed with Sarah over border patrols, watched Damien's growing presence with narrowed eyes and a tightening jaw. He had been one of Alaric's closest advisors once, and after the king's death, he had quietly gathered more and more influence over the council, always positioning himself as the voice of caution, the protector of tradition. An alliance between Sarah and Damien, formed not through conquest but through genuine trust, threatened something Colt clearly did not want threatened, though exactly what that was remained hidden behind his carefully polite smiles. It was Damien, with a king's sharp instinct for reading dangerous men, who noticed it first. "Your advisor Rayner," he said to Sarah one evening, "he watches me the way a man watches something he intends to remove." "Colt has been loyal to this pack for years," Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, a small, uneasy doubt stirred in her chest, one she had never quite let herself examine. "Loyal to the pack," Damien said carefully, "or loyal to his own position within it. Those are not always the same thing." Sarah wanted to dismiss it as a stranger's suspicion, but the seed had been planted, and over the following days, she found herself watching Colt more closely than she had in years. She noticed small things. The way he always seemed to know decisions before they were officially announced. The way certain trade routes near the border, routes Alaric had personally overseen before his death, had quietly shifted control since then, moving further and further under Colt's influence. The way he had been the one to insist, 2 years ago, that Alaric ride the northern patrol alone, that final night, against the king's usual custom of taking guards. The pieces did not fit together cleanly, not yet, but they were pieces nonetheless, and once Sarah began looking for them, she could not stop. She brought it up carefully during a routine visit to the Eastern Trading Post, using the excuse of checking on grain supplies to walk the border road Colt had rerouted control over the year before. The merchants there greeted her warmly, as they always did, but she noticed how quickly they glanced toward the hills whenever Colt's name came up, how their answers grew shorter and more careful, as though they were choosing each word the way one chooses steps across thin ice. "Your advisor has been generous with the northern traders," one older merchant told her, not quite meeting her eyes. "More generous than the treasury reports would suggest he has the right to be." It was a small thing, the kind of comment that could mean nothing at all, and yet it sat heavily in Sarah's chest the entire ride back to the castle. She said nothing of it to Colt directly. Instead, she said it to Damien that evening, turning the words over out loud as if speaking them might help her understand them better. "Men like that rarely leave a single loose thread," Damien said, once she had finished. "If he has been moving resources quietly for a year, there will be records somewhere, even if he has hidden them well. Men who believe themselves untouchable often forget to hide things as carefully as they should." "You sound like you have dealt with men like him before," Sarah said. "I have built an empire," Damien said simply. "Every empire collects men who want a piece of it for themselves. I have learned to recognize the look in their eyes long before they ever raise a hand against me." In the days leading up to that discovery, something had been quietly settling inside Damien, something he had not expected and did not entirely know how to name. He caught himself, more than once, listening for the sound of small feet running down the hallway before he even realized he was doing it. He found himself saving the last piece of bread at breakfast because Wolf always asked for it, and setting aside interesting stones he found in the garden because Wren had started a collection and insisted every king must contribute to it properly. He had spent his whole life believing that strength meant needing no one, that the moment you let yourself care about something soft was the moment someone could use it against you. And yet here he was, a king who had built an empire on that very belief, sitting on the nursery floor most evenings, building towers out of wooden blocks, with 2 children who were not his by blood and had never once asked him if he deserved to be there. They had simply decided, and their certainty had slowly worn down every wall he had spent a lifetime building. He said as much to Sarah one quiet evening, the two of them standing in the hallway after the twins had finally been coaxed to sleep. "I did not come here to want this," he admitted, his voice lower than usual. "I came here for a throne." "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now I am no longer certain the throne was ever the thing worth wanting," he said, and the honesty in his voice startled them both into a silence that felt, for the first time, comfortable rather than tense. The truth came together faster than either of them expected, and in a way that put the twins directly in danger. It was Wren who noticed it first, in the innocent, unfiltered way only children notice things adults have trained themselves to overlook. She had wandered near Colt's study one afternoon while chasing a rolling ball, and through the partly open door she saw him speaking quietly with a stranger in unfamiliar clothing, a messenger from beyond Silverpine's borders. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone, sharp and secretive, the kind grown-ups only used when they did not want to be overheard. She mentioned it to her mother that night, simply, the way children mention anything, without realizing its weight. The man with the gray robes was talking to a stranger. He looked angry that I saw him. Sarah's blood ran cold. That night, she and Damien met privately, setting aside the careful distance they had maintained since his arrival, and spoke openly for the first time about what they both suspected. Colt Rayner had likely orchestrated Alaric's death 2 years ago, weakening Silverpine's leadership just enough to eventually justify exactly the kind of external claim Damien had arrived with, though whether Colt intended to hand the territory to Ashgrove or seize it for himself through the resulting chaos was still unclear. What was clear was that with Sarah and Damien growing closer, instead of clashing, his plan, whatever its final shape had been, was falling apart, and desperate men did desperate things. "We need proof," Sarah said, pacing the length of the room. "Suspicion is not enough to move against a member of my own council." "Then we will find proof," Damien said. "But Sarah, listen to me. If he feels cornered, he may act rashly, and your children are the ones who saw him. We need to protect them first, before anything else." For the first time since his arrival, Sarah did not flinch at his use of her first name, nor at the protective certainty in his voice. She simply nodded, because in that moment she trusted him completely, without hesitation, in a way she had not trusted anyone since Alaric's death. They doubled the guard around the twins immediately, quietly, without alerting the wider household to their suspicions. For 2 days, the castle carried on as if nothing had changed. Meals served as usual, lessons continued as usual, though Sarah found herself counting her children twice as often, glancing toward doorways a beat longer than she used to, unable to shake the tight, coiled feeling in her chest that told her something was coming even before she had any proof of what. Damien noticed the change in her almost immediately, the way she had gone quiet during meals, the way her eyes tracked every servant who entered a room a little too closely. On the second evening he found her standing outside the twins' door, long after they had fallen asleep, exactly the way old Mira had found her that very first night he arrived. "You don't have to carry this awake-all-night version of guarding them," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I am not going anywhere. Neither are the guards outside their window." "I have done this alone for 2 years," Sarah said. "It is hard to remember how to do it any other way." "You don't have to remember," Damien said. "You only have to let someone else help you carry it, even for 1 night." She did not answer him with words, but she did, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allow herself to leave the hallway and actually sleep that night, trusting, in a way that both frightened and steadied her, that someone else was watching over what mattered most while she rested. But Colt, sensing the shifting mood in the castle, sensing perhaps that his carefully built position was beginning to crumble, grew desperate faster than either of them anticipated. 2 nights later, during a storm that rattled the windows and filled the halls with the sound of wind and distant thunder, Colt attempted to take matters into his own hands. He tried to slip the twins out of the castle under the cover of the storm, using a side passage few people knew existed, planning, it would later become clear, to use them as leverage, a way to force Sarah into stepping down quietly rather than risk her children's safety. But he had underestimated one simple thing. Wolf pups, even very young ones, know the scent of danger long before adults notice it, and Wolf woke the moment an unfamiliar hand closed around his wrist, letting out a sharp, piercing cry that echoed down the stone hallway. Damien was the one who heard it first. He had been unable to sleep that night, restless with worry he had not fully admitted even to himself, and he was already moving before the sound had finished echoing down the stone corridor. He took the stairs 2 at a time, following the direction of the cry with the kind of focus that came from years of trusting his instincts in dangerous moments, and he reached the mouth of the side passage just as Colt was dragging both children toward the hidden door at its far end. The passage was narrow and dimly lit, lined with old storage chests nobody had opened in years, and for one long, tense moment, the only sound was Wolf's frightened breathing and the scrape of Colt's boots against the stone floor as he froze at the sight of Damien, blocking the only way out. "Let them go, Raynor," Damien said, his voice low and utterly still, the kind of stillness that was far more frightening than shouting would have been. "Whatever you think this accomplishes, it ends the moment you release them." Colt's 2 accompanying guards exchanged an uncertain glance, clearly having agreed to this plan without fully understanding what it would mean to stand against an alpha king in a narrow stone hallway. Their hesitation was all it took. Damien did not raise his voice again. He simply took one slow step forward, and the guards, weighing loyalty to a desperate advisor against the very real danger standing in front of them, chose to step aside instead. That single moment of hesitation was enough for Sarah, alerted by the commotion and already running with her heart in her throat, to arrive with her own guards close behind, and the sight of their queen, fierce and unshaken even in her nightclothes, was enough to finally break whatever resolve Colt had left. "It's over, Raynor," Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury and relief in equal measure as she pulled her children safely against her. "Whatever you were planning, it ends tonight." Colt, cornered and finally out of options, did not deny it. The truth spilled out in broken pieces, confirming everything Sarah and Damien had suspected. He had arranged the ambush that led to Alaric's death, believing that a weakened Silverpine would eventually fall under his own influence, especially once the old Ashgrove Treaty could be quietly used as leverage. He had never expected Damien to arrive with honest intentions, and he certainly had never expected Sarah and Damien to grow close instead of clashing, ruining the very conflict he had hoped to exploit. Colt was stripped of his position and banished from Silverpine that same week, sent away to face judgment under the old laws, far from the children he had tried to use and the throne he had tried to steal. In the quiet days that followed, something in Silverpine finally settled, like a held breath finally released. The council gathered the morning after, somber and shaken, and for once, nobody suggested that the queen needed a king standing beside her to prove her strength. They had seen, with their own eyes, exactly what she was capable of, uncovering a betrayal that had gone unnoticed for 2 full years, one that had cost her the mate she loved and nearly cost her the children she had protected fiercely ever since. Several advisors who had once whispered doubts about her now approached her directly, offering quiet apologies for words they had let slip too easily over the past 2 years. Sarah accepted each one with the same steady grace she had carried through everything else, though privately, she found she no longer needed their approval the way she once might have. She had already proven what she needed to prove, first to herself, and everyone else had simply caught up. The council, having seen firsthand how close they had come to losing everything through hidden betrayal rather than honest challenge, no longer questioned Sarah's strength as queen. If anything, they respected her more for having uncovered the truth herself, alongside a man who could have easily used the chaos to seize the throne outright and chose, instead, to protect her family. It was Damien who brought up the old treaty again, though not in the way anyone expected. "I came here to claim a throne," he said to Sarah, standing once more in the courtyard where they had first met, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "I no longer want it. Not like this. Not through an old scroll and a law neither of us chose." "Then what do you want?" Sarah asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "I want what your children already understood the first night we met," he said quietly. "Something I did not let myself want until I saw it reflected back at me through them. I have spent 2 years telling myself I did not need anyone," Sarah said quietly. "That leaning on someone else was the same as admitting I could not do this alone." "You have already proven you can do it alone," Damien said. "This is not about needing me, Sarah. It never was. Not really. It is about choosing to build something with someone, even when you are already strong enough not to." "And the twins?" she asked, though she already knew the answer, had known it, perhaps, since that very first evening in the West study. "They chose me before I even understood what that meant," Damien said, a rare softness in his voice. "I do not intend to make liars out of them now." Sarah did not answer with words. She simply closed the distance between them, and for the first time in 2 long, exhausting years, she let herself lean on someone else's strength instead of carrying everything alone. Word of their engagement spread through Silverpine within a single day, carried by servants and guards and merchants far faster than any official announcement could have managed. To Sarah's quiet surprise, the reaction was almost entirely joyful. The pack had watched her carry the weight of leadership alone for 2 years, had watched her grieve without ever once letting it break her, and now they watched her choose happiness for herself, without any of the guilt she might once have felt for wanting it. Even the most cautious council members, The ones who had once whispered that Aluna needed a king to rule properly, found they could not argue with a match built on genuine trust rather than old law. The twins, for their part, treated the entire engagement as though it were simply the correction of an obvious mistake that the grown-ups around them had taken far too long to notice. Wolf announced the news to every guard, servant, and visiting merchant he could find over the following week, always ending with the same proud declaration that he had known it from the very first night and had simply been waiting patiently for everyone else to catch up. The wedding that followed was small, quiet, held in the same courtyard where a stranger had once arrived with a scroll and a claim, though no scroll was needed this time. Only two people who had chosen each other freely, and two children who had somehow known the truth before either adult had been brave enough to admit it. Old Mira stood near the front, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her shawl and telling anyone who would listen that she had known it from the very first week, that she had seen it coming long before either the queen or the king had admitted anything to themselves. The council, once so quick to doubt Sarah's ability to rule alone, now stood watching with quiet approval, having learned, in the hardest way possible, exactly how much strength she had carried the entire time without any of their help. Wolf wore a small coat that matched Damien's, insisting on it for a full week leading up to the ceremony, while Wren carried a basket of pine branches instead of flowers, since pine, she informed everyone seriously, smelled more like home than any flower ever could. Halfway through the ceremony, unable to wait any longer, Wolf abandoned his place beside the front row entirely and marched straight up to stand between his mother and the man he had claimed as his father from the very first night, refusing to move even when old Mira tried gently to guide him back. Nobody in the courtyard minded. If anything, it felt like the most honest part of the entire day, a small boy simply standing exactly where he had always known he belonged. Ashgrove and Silverpine were united that year, not through conquest, not through an old law written centuries before either of them were born, but through something far simpler and far stronger. A family built not out of duty, but out of two small pups who had looked at a stranger once thought to be an enemy, and had known, with the simple certainty only children possess, exactly where he belonged. Years later, when Wren and Wolf were old enough to understand the full story, their parents would tell it to them by the fire, exactly the way it happened, without leaving out the part where two 4-year-olds had chosen their father long before anyone else in the castle understood what was happening. And every time the story was told, Wolf would grin and say the same thing, proud and unbothered by the weight of everything that had come before. "I knew it first," he would say. "I always know." And nobody in that family, not Sarah, not Damien, ever once disagreed with him. In the years that followed, Silverpine and Ashgrove grew into something neither territory had managed alone, a stretch of land where pine forests met open plains, where two packs that had once eyed each other with suspicion learned instead to share border patrols and harvest festivals and long winter nights around shared fires. Sarah still rose before the sun most mornings, still reviewed reports and settled disputes with the same steady focus she always had. But she no longer did it with the particular loneliness that used to sit in her chest like a stone. Damien learned, slowly and sometimes clumsily, how to be part of a family rather than simply the leader of an empire, and though he never fully lost the careful watchfulness that had kept him alive through a hard childhood, he softened enough to let his children climb into his lap without flinching, enough to laugh freely at Wolf's increasingly elaborate fort designs, enough to sit by the fire some evenings and simply exist without calculating anything at all. Wren grew into a sharp, thoughtful young wolf, the kind who noticed things before anyone else did, much the way she had noticed a stranger speaking too quietly behind a study door years before. Wolf grew loud and confident and endlessly curious, forever convinced he had been right about something before anyone else figured it out, a trait his parents found equal parts exhausting and endearing. And on quiet evenings, when the fire burned low and the whole castle had gone still, Sarah would sometimes catch Damien watching their children with an expression she recognized easily now, the same look she herself wore whenever she remembered exactly how close she had come to losing everything, and exactly how much had been given back to her instead, not by an old law written centuries before either of them were born, but by two small pups who had simply known, from the very first night, exactly where their family was always meant to be found.